For more on all the developments in the Israeli-Hamas conflict, I'm joined by Middle East analyst Matthew Brodsky and David Mack, former U.S. ambassador to the UAE. Gentlemen, thank you so much for joining us. Matt, let's start with you. Both sides have agreed to a 12-hour truce. What do you make of it? Do you think that this agreement, the fact that there was an agreement, is a breakthrough? And can they work from here?
I don't know that a humanitarian 12-hour ceasefire is a breakthrough per se, but it will definitely allow Palestinians some measure of relief, and I suppose that is needed. It's not a 7-day ceasefire, and the plan that Kerry was floating by that Israel rejected was a bad plan that was essentially a Qatari-type plan, which fell flat on many things that Israel wanted to do, such as it would have just given Hamas time to rearm and regroup. It wouldn't have dealt with demilitarizing the Gaza Strip, and it wouldn't have had Israel dealing with the tunnels, so it was a bad deal. This is a good thing that needs to happen, but it's not a game changer.
But Ambassador, this is an agreement. I mean, both sides agreed, no matter how small it is, they agreed on something.
Well, there was a lot of pressure on both sides to relieve the real burden on Palestinian moms and dads and so on, who need to relieve their families. They need to do some shopping. They need to sometimes get to a hospital. I think that it was something that needed to happen. Both the Israeli government and the Hamas leadership were under a tremendous amount of pressure to at least allow this much to take place.
Pressure by their own people? I mean, you mentioned some of the folks that are on the ground, and we're not talking politicians, but people on both sides that are living there.
That's interesting. I mean, I think there's a lot of pressure on the Israeli government from the Israeli people themselves, who do see a level of suffering taking place that they would not intend. But also, there is growing worldwide sympathy with the people of Gaza, not with Hamas. Hamas doesn't gain sympathy from anybody, so far as I know, or any government, but from worldwide, both governments and the ordinary people in the street see what's happening to the people of Gaza and say, hey, give those folks a break.
But what makes this conflict different? Why the sympathy, Matt? I'd like you to address what the ambassador had to say, and then maybe get your take on that part of it as well.
Well, I would have to say, I don't know that it's a lot of pressure from the Israeli public on the Israeli government itself for a humanitarian ceasefire. They are revolted by images of Palestinian suffering, as we are, as anyone else would be. That's the truth. The problem is to stop this cycle, which keeps on happening. Israel needs to be allowed to win. They need to be allowed to demilitarize the Gaza Strip and to tackle the tunnels. Every time in 2006 with Lebanon and Hezbollah, the international outcry for a ceasefire doesn't allow Israel to finish the job. Hezbollah, in that case, restocked its missiles to having way more than they had before then. Hamas has done the same since 2008 and 2012. So if you want the situation to continue the exact same way it is, then stop Israel right now. If you want to change things for the better, let Israel handle the situation. The United States would do really well to step in after that is done, to work with Fatah, the Palestinian Authority, to have them put back in charge of Gaza, have the Palestinian Authority drop Hamas from the unity government, but make sure that Mahmoud Abbas is strengthened, and then Israel can work with Abbas and work with the security services, and that would pave the way toward any type of future peace agreement. Right now, continuing the status quo, we've seen how this goes, and we're just going to remain here.
Has any side benefited from the fighting as it has taken place?
I want at this point just to follow up on something Matt said, but it's also responsive to your question. It's a fiction that you can ever solve this problem by winning a war. Certainly, you can't do it by winning a fairly modest operation like this. You could say, I suppose, that the major wars that took place in 1967 and 1973 led to at least some kind of progress ultimately. But that's definitely not the case with this kind of operation.
It could be like the West Bank. And that's a step up.
Well,
Don't you agree?
it would be a major step up if it were like the West Bank, but we are dealing with an entirely different population here. We're dealing with 1.7 million people who are basically living in a prison in one of the most intensely populated areas in the world, and well over half of them are refugees from Israel proper, particularly the areas around Tel Aviv and Beersheba. So this is a very difficult kind of situation, and unless somehow it's joined to an overall peace process that includes the West Bank,
Which can't happen, though, with Hamas.
I would agree with you, is centered on the PLO leadership. And this unity government, which was established between the Mahmoud Abbas and Hamas, included the idea that you would have a technocratic government, you would be able to continue with the peace process basically on Hamas terms.
But this was prior to the discovery
you
of the offensive
the
tunnels.
peace process on Mahmoud Abbas's terms. I think the Israeli intelligence has known about the tunnels for a long time. And there's a lot of people who believe that the Israelis were looking for an excuse to go into Gaza to deal with the tunnels.
Come on.
No.
Hamas was looking at this as a way to get money. They were strapped.
This is what M.J. Rosenberg, a very prominent former AIPAC lobbyist in Washington, has reported.
I mean, it'd be hard to say that he would be representative of most Israeli viewpoints, but that aside,
he's representative of a lot of the American Jewish community, Matt.
Gentlemen, let me turn your attention to the Islamic State and looking at this at a wider regional picture. You've got a lot of players going on behind the scenes, trying to hammer something out in Cairo. Now they're going to Paris. But how has the Islamic State affected the dynamics and the chemistry of how all of these people are playing?
Well, you point to a very important thing. There are some incredibly important historical developments going on in the Arab world that have very little to do with the Palestinian-Israeli dispute. So things that are going on in Iraq and Syria largely have a dynamic of their own that is sometimes affected by Arab-Israeli issues, but is mostly, these are great historic movements that are taking place and great developments that, if nothing else, do tend to focus the attention of other governments in the region on issues other than the Arab-Israeli dispute.
There is one common thread between them, and that is they are Islamist groups looking to take over and establish Sharia law, ISIS in Iraq and Syria and beyond. Hamas, their goal isn't just the liberation of Palestine, it's the same situation. They're the same type of group. Al-Qaeda, the same type of situation. That's the common thread, is the rise of Islamism in the Middle East and the retreat of secularism in the Middle East.
Matt, I'll let you have the last word there. We've got to go, gentlemen, but thank you so much for our discussion here.